Frau Hirsch had shown her the underfloor space in the summer of 1868. When Beulah arrived at the Hirsch farm for the birth of their youngest grandchild and found Frau Hirsch on her knees at a trap door in the floor, lifting out a bundle of dried chamomile tied with linen cord. The Hirsch family had come to Tishomingo County from Baden in 1851, bringing with them a specific set of building practices that differed from the Scots-Irish and English descent families who made up most of the county's farm population. Their cabin was skirted on all four sides with board and batten that closed the crawl space to the outside air, and the floor had 3 trap doors set at different positions, and the underfloor space was divided by plank partition walls into 3 sections that Frau Hirsch used for different purposes. She had explained it while Beulah waited for the labor to progress. The north section, she said, stayed cold year-round because the ground under it never saw sun, and the north side of the skirting kept the cold air in around the roots. She kept her root vegetables there, the potatoes and sweet potatoes and turnips and beets, through the summer without them going soft, and through the winter without them freezing. The south section was slightly warmer because the stove's heat came through the floorboards above it in winter, and the summer sun heated the south skirting face enough to warm the air inside a few degrees above the north section. She kept her seeds and dried herbs there, the planting stock for the next year's garden, and the medicinal herbs she gathered in August. The east section had a 2-inch hole bored through the east skirting with a sliding wooden cover, and she kept the cured meats and the hard cheeses there, because the air movement through the vent prevented the surface dampness that developed on cured goods in a sealed, humid space. Frau Hirsch had said, 3 different places for 3 different needs. The ground does most of the work. The skirting holds the conditions in. The partitions keep the zones separate. The vent does the one thing the ground cannot do alone, which is to move the air on the meat side. Beulah had admired the system. She had thought, that is a complete provision against the storage problems we all have. She had noted it the way she noted the medicinal preparations she observed in other households, stored in memory for later use when the need arose. The need had not arisen while Levi was alive. Levi managed the food supply the way Tishomingo County farm families had managed it for 2 generations: the outdoor root pit for root vegetables, the loft for seeds and dried goods, the smokehouse for cured meats. The pit flooded in spring and lost a portion of its contents to rot every year. The loft got too hot and humid in July and August, and the seed corn occasionally molded in a wet summer. The smokehouse was adequate for the cured meats through winter, but the surface mold came back in August when the humidity in the Tishomingo County hills reached 75% for weeks at a time. Levi had accepted these losses as normal. Every farm had them, and managed the surplus stocks accordingly, putting up more in autumn than strictly needed to account for the summer losses. Levi died of fever in the autumn of 1874. The fever was malaria, which was common in the low areas of Tishomingo County, and he had had it twice before and recovered, and the third time he did not recover. He was dead by October, and Beulah was 46 years old and alone on 20 acres of hill land, with a cabin that had no skirting and a crawl space that chickens slept under. In the summer of 1875, her first summer alone, the storage losses accumulated in a specific sequence that made the total impact clear. In May, the spring rains flooded the root pit and rotted the remaining sweet potatoes from the winter's storage. In June, the early summer heat in the loft reached 90 degrees for 3 consecutive weeks, and the dried chamomile she had hung from the loft rafters in August of the previous year lost its scent and its color. Dried and dead, rather than dried and preserved, the medicinal oils driven off by the heat. In July she noticed a thin surface bloom developing on the cured ham she had put up in January. In August, the seed corn she had been saving for 3 years, a specific variety of white dent corn that Levi's family had been maintaining since 1831. 44 years of selected seed showed the gray-green spots of mold on the surface of the kernels when she opened the storage crock in the loft. The crock had been sealed with wax. The humidity had gotten in any way through the lid fit. 3 days of 95-degree heat in the loft had given the mold what it needed. She sat with the molded seed corn in her lap and thought about Frau Hirsch's underfloor space for the first time since 1868. The seed corn was the decisive loss. The root pit flooding and the herb degradation and the ham surface mold were losses that could be managed. She could put up more roots, gather more herbs, trim the surface mold from the ham. The seed corn was 7 years of her personal selection work on top of Levi's family's 44 years of maintenance. She could replace the variety from a neighbor's stock, but the specific selection characteristics she and Levi had been developing, the earlier maturity date, the slightly higher starch content, the resistance to the root rot fungus that had damaged some neighboring farms' corn, were in those seeds, and they were gone. She would not lose them again. The underfloor space would not let them go. The cabin's crawl space was 24 inches deep between the ground and the floor. Joists sufficient for the north and east zone storage she needed, and sufficient on the south side for the shallow shelf racks for seeds and herbs. The crawl space ran the full 16 by 20-foot footprint of the cabin and was currently open on all 4 sides. The chickens, having worn a visible track around the perimeter where they entered and exited. She would need to skirt 3 sides with Bourdain batten, build partition walls inside, cut 3 trapdoors in the floor, build the seed racks for the south zone, fill the north zone with the sand bins for root vegetable storage, and bore the twinch vent in the east, skirting with a sliding cover. She began in September of 1875 and finished in late October, working before and after the farm tasks that could not wait. Using the boards from the collapsed hay barn section that Levi had been planning to rebuild and the tools he had left in the tool shed. The skirting went up first, Bourdain batten on the north, east, and west sides, cut from the collapsed barn boards and nailed to the foundation piers with the cut nails from Levi's supply. The south side she left open for the access panel, a 3-foot wide hinged section that would allow her to load bulk items into the crawl space that would not fit through the floor trapdoors. The skirting changed the crawl space immediately and visibly within 3 days of completing the north and east sides. The ground under the cabin felt cooler to the touch through the open south access, the skirted enclosure having begun to trap the ground's ambient temperature rather than exchanging it continuously with the outside air. The partition walls she built from the same barn boards to walls running north-south, dividing the 16-foot east-west width of the crawl space into 3 sections. The east partition wall ran from the east skirting to the center of the space, enclosing an 8-by-8-foot section on the east side for the cured meat zone. The west partition wall ran from the west, skirting to the center, enclosing an 8-by-8-foot section on the west that she joined to the north zone, giving the root vegetable section a full 16-by-8-foot area. The remaining 16-by-8-foot south section became the seed and herb zone. She bored the 2-inch vent hole through the east skirting, at 18 inches above the ground, centered on the east face of the east zone enclosure, and fitted it with a sliding wooden cover cut from a 1/4-inch pine scrap. Slide it right to close, slide it left to open, a 2-inch aperture. She would open it in summer when the outdoor air was drier than the zone interior, and close it in winter when the outdoor air was too cold. The 3 trapdoors she cut in the floor over the following 2 weeks: the north zone door in the floor plank nearest the north wall, the south zone door near the south wall, the east zone door near the east wall. Each door 16 inches by 20 inches, the same dimension Mercy Holt in Massachusetts had used for her firewood trapdoor, arrived at independently as the minimum opening for passing a ham section or a root vegetable crock through vertically. She hung each door on 2 strap hinges with a turn button latch and fitted a rope pull through a gimlet hole at the corner. The sand bins for the north zone she made from rough sawn boards nailed into 3-sided open-top boxes, 12 inches deep and 18 inches square, filled with dry creek sand. Root vegetables buried in dry sand kept better than root vegetables in bins or on shelves. The sand excluded air from the vegetable surface, slowing the respiration that drove softening and rotting. She had seen this at the Hirsch farm. Frau Hirsch had kept her carrots and parsnips in sandboxes, and they were firm in March when the neighbors' root pit carrots had gone limp. The south's sewn shelf racks she built from thin lath strips nailed to small uprights. The racks spaced 4 inches apart to allow air circulation between the seed packets and herb bundles stored on them. Seeds and herbs needed air movement, not the Ventravin movement of the east zone, but the passive circulation of a space that was not sealed tight. She left a 1-inch gap at the top of the south partition wall to allow a slow drift between the south zone and the adjacent areas. She loaded the system in November of 1875, the sweet potatoes and Irish potatoes and beets and turnips into the sand bins in the north zone, the seed corn and the replacement seed stocks and the dried herb bundles and the medicine papers into the south zone racks, the cured hams from the smokehouse into the east zone on low wooden hooks she had driven into the east skirting interior face. In June of 1876 she opened the south zone trapdoor and retrieved the seed corn she had loaded in November. The kernels were firm. The color was unchanged, the cream white of well-dried white dent corn. She pressed her thumbnail into the surface of one kernel, hard. She put a kernel in her mouth and pressed it between her teeth. It cracked cleanly, the interior chalky white and dry. She counted the kernels in the handful she had retrieved, all viable by appearance. She would plant a test row first, as she always did, and assess germination before the full planting. But the seeds had come through the Mississippi winter and the first 6 weeks of the Mississippi summer without losing their viability to heat and humidity. In August, she opened the north zone trapdoor and retrieved the early potatoes she had let accumulate there through the summer. Firm, no soft spots, no surface mold. The outdoor root pit at Ida Chumley's farm, a mile to the south, had lost nearly half its summer potato accumulation to rot. The pit had been warm and humid through July, and the potatoes had softened and begun to break down at the surface. Beulah's north zone, 58 to 62 degrees through July and August. The Earth's ground temperature maintained by the skirting enclosure with no direct solar input to the north face. In August, she also opened the east zone trap door and examined the ham sections. Surface dry, no mold bloom. The 2-inch vent had been open since June. drawing the drier morning air through the east zone and moving the overnight humidity out before it could establish on the ham surface. Ida Chumley's smokehouse hams had developed the characteristic August surface mold that required trimming before use, not dangerous, but wasteful, and a sign of inadequate air movement. Ida Chumley came to Beulah's farm in late August for the reciprocal visit that was the Tishomingo County social rhythm. The two women had been trading help and company since before Levi died. She came into the cabin and noticed the 3 trapdoor handles set into the floor at different positions. She said, "What are those?" Beulah showed her. She opened the north trapdoor first and lifted out a firm potato from the sand bin below. Ida held it, firm. She looked at the trapdoor opening and at the sand bin visible below, and at the underside of the floor joists running above the sand. She said, "It is a root cellar under the floor." Beulah said, "North zone. Stays between 58 and 62 degrees in summer. The sand keeps the air off the vegetables." She opened the south trapdoor and held up a bundle of dried chamomile from the rack below. Ida pressed it, and the dried flower heads crumbled at the touch, properly dried and preserved, not the limp, degraded herb that too much summer heat and humidity produced. She said, "How is the herb dry in August?" Beulah said, "South zone, slightly warmer than the north. The floor above it gets more stove heat in winter and more summer warmth from the south side. Not cold enough to damage the herbs, dry enough to preserve them. The gap at the top of the partition lets the air move slowly." She opened the east trapdoor and lifted out the edge of the nearest ham section, dry surface, no mold. She explained the touch vent and the sliding cover. Ida looked at the 3 open trapdoors in the floor and the 3 different zones they opened to. She said, "You have 3 different cellars under one floor," Beulah said, "3 zones in one space. The ground does most of the work. I just divided the space to use what the ground provides in each section differently." Ida said, "Frau Hirsch had something like this." Beulah said, "Frau Hirsch had this. I adapted it to our construction and our climate. She showed me in 1868 when I came for the birth." Ida said, "I remember Frau Hirsch. She always had the best herbs of anyone in the county." Beulah said, "She had the best herbs because she stored them correctly. Come back in October and I will show you how to build it." The physics of why the 3 zones maintained different temperature ranges within the same enclosed crawl space requires specific explanation, because the mechanism depended on understanding how heat moved through the floor above and the earth below differently in each zone. The north zone's cold came from 2 sources: the earth directly below it and the absence of solar heat on the north skirting face. The earth under the cabin at 18 to 24 inches depth maintained approximately 58 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in Tishomingo County, the same ground temperature stability that appeared throughout this series as the basis for bellow-grade storage. The north skirting face received no direct sun from October through March and minimal sun in summer, because the north face was shaded by the cabin's own overhang, with the skirting enclosing the space and stopping the hot outdoor summer air from circulating through. The north zone's temperature was set almost entirely by the Earth's ambient temperature. In July, when the outdoor air was 95 degrees and the unenclosed crawl space would have been 80 degrees from outdoor air infiltration, the enclosed north zone stayed at 58 to 62. The south zone's slightly higher temperature came from the floorboards above it. In winter, the cast iron stove in the cabin burned through the cooking and heating hours and raised the cabin interior to to 60 to 65 degrees. The floorboards conducted a fraction of that heat downward through the south zone's ceiling, raising the south zone temperature 3 to 8 degrees above the north zone. In summer, the stove was cold, but the south-facing skirting absorbed some solar heat through the board surface and transmitted it into the south zone air, again raising the temperature 3 to 5 degrees above the north zone. The south zone was consistently and predictably warmer than the north zone by a small margin across all seasons. This small temperature differential was the specific condition that seeds and dried herbs required. Seeds stored at 50 degrees maintained their viability for years. Seeds stored at 70 degrees lost viability more rapidly, especially in humid conditions. The south zone's 55 to 65 degree range was above the optimal seed storage temperature but well below the loft's 90-degree July temperature that had destroyed the seed corn in 1875. The south zone's moderate temperature, combined with the passive air circulation through the partition wall gap, kept the relative humidity in the zone below the 65% threshold above which mold develops on stored seed. The east zone's specific requirement, air movement to prevent surface mold on cured meats, was the one condition the earth and the floor could not provide naturally. A sealed enclosed space reached humidity equilibrium with the ground moisture and the stored goods within a few days, and once equilibrium was reached, the relative humidity in the sealed space was determined by the ground moisture and the goods themselves. In a Mississippi summer, the ground moisture was higher than in New England or the northern states, and the equilibrium humidity in a sealed underfloor space was often above the mold growth threshold. The tunge vent, with its sliding cover, solved this specifically. A tunge vent in an 8 by 8 foot space provided an air exchange rate of approximately 1 complete air change every 12 to 16 hours at the prevailing summer wind conditions in Tishomingo County, slow enough not to import the full outdoor summer heat, fast enough to continuously replace the high humidity east zone air with drier air from outside. The drier replacement air dropped the relative humidity in the east zone below the mold threshold and maintained it there through the summer months when the vent was open. In winter she closed the vent to prevent the outside cold from dropping the east zone temperature below the point where the ham fat would begin to solidify and change texture. She cracked the vent cover slightly, perhaps a quarter-inch, during the winter months to maintain minimal air movement without allowing the full winter cold to enter. The ham sections required some air movement year-round to stay dry. What changed seasonally was the amount. Beulah had learned the vent management from Frau Hirsch's explanation in 1868 and had refined it through the first winter of operation. She noted in October 1875, when she first closed the vent fully, that the east zone had developed a slightly closed smell within a week, and she cracked the cover to the quarter-inch position, and the smell dissipated within 2 days. She kept the cover at the quarter-inch crack through the winter and opened it fully from April through October. The construction details of the underfloor system that the main account summarizes require specific description because the skirting installation was the foundational step that made everything else function, and the specific challenges of the partition wall construction in the confined crawl space were the most physically demanding part of the build. The skirting was the first step because without it, the closed underfloor space could not develop or maintain the temperature zones that the storage required. An open crawl space exchanged air continuously with the outside in summer. Hot, humid Mississippi air circulated freely beneath the floor, raising the underfloor temperature to match the outside air. In winter, cold outside air circulated freely, dropping the underfloor temperature to near the outside temperature. The Earth's moderating influence was overwhelmed by the continuous air exchange. The skirting stopped the exchange and allowed the Earth to set the temperature. She chose Bourdain batten skirting because she had the barn boards available and because Bourdain batten was the fastest construction she could build alone. The vertical boards were nailed to the foundation piers with 2 nails each, one at the top, one at the bottom. The battens were nailed over the vertical board joints to cover the gaps. She worked around the perimeter from the northeast corner westward to the northwest corner, then south along the west side, leaving the south side open for last. She fitted the boards tightly at the top where they met the floor framing and left a half-inch gap at the bottom where they met the ground, which allowed drainage when the spring rains produced surface runoff. The south side access panel she built last and hung on to wrought iron hinges salvaged from the collapsed barn section. The panel was 3 feet wide and 30 inches tall, large enough to pass a ham section or a crock of root vegetables through horizontally. She fitted it with a haspen pin closure, a bent iron staple on the panel, and a pin through it from the frame, which she could remove and rehang with one hand while holding a supply item in the other. The partition walls were the most physically demanding part because they required working inside the crawl space on her knees in the 24-inch headroom. She cut the partition boards to length, 24 inches tall to fit from ground to the underside of the floor joists, and drove them into position against the floor joists above and the ground below. The boards could not be nailed to the floor joists from below. The joist nailing surface was inaccessible at the joist bottom without a nail gun she did not have. She solved this by cutting the boards slightly long and springing them into position against the joists under compression. Like a floor plate pressed between 2 walls, the compression held them plumb and stable. She added a single diagonal brace from each partition wall to an adjacent foundation pier to prevent racking. The partition wall gap at the top, the 1-inch space she left between the top of the south partition wall and the floor joists above, she created by cutting those boards an inch shorter than the space height. She could have filled this gap with mortar or caulk to seal the south zone from the other zones, but Frau Hirsch's description had specified a small gap for air circulation, and she retained it. The sandbins were the simplest construction, rough sawn boards nailed into open-topped boxes 20 inches square, the nails driven from the outside face so the interior surface was smooth. She filled them with dry creek sand, carried in the bucket over 3 afternoons, approximately 400 pounds of sand distributed across the 3 bins in the north zone. She had poured the sand dry, having dried it in the sun for 2 days after bringing it from the creek bank, to ensure that the initial sand moisture did not add to the zone humidity. The seed racks were the most precise work, thin lath strips, 3/8 of an inch thick, nailed to short uprights with gaps wide enough for air circulation. She spaced the rack layers 4 inches apart, which allowed the herb bundles to hang without touching and the seed packets to sit without stacking. She used 16-inch lengths of lath for the rack surface, matching the spacing of the floor joists above so that each rack section sat within one joist bay and could be slid out through the trap door for loading and unloading without disassembly. The trap doors she cut with the crosscut saw, working from above, having first marked the cut lines with the chalk line stretched across the floorboards. She made the cuts at the midpoints of the floor joists, the same position Mercy Holt had used in Massachusetts, for the same reason. Cutting at the midpoint left half the joist width supporting each adjacent floorboard and prevented the cut ends from sagging. She hung each door on 2 strap hinges and fitted the rope pull through a gimlet hole at the door corner. The complete construction from the first skirting board to the loaded system took 7 weeks, in September and October of 1875. She worked 2 to 3 hours each day before and after the regular farm work, and 4 hours on the Sundays when the farm work permitted it. The total material cost was approximately $1.40 in cut nails, strap hinges, and the hasp hardware, the boards from the collapsed barn, the sand from the creek, and all the other materials were on the farm at no cash cost. The Mississippi context of 1875 shaped the specific vulnerabilities the underfloor system addressed, and explains why the system that Frau Hirsch had built for a Bodian immigrant family in the 1850s was adapted into a form that addressed the distinctly Mississippi combination of hot humid summers and cold winter snap freezes. Tishomingo County, in the northeastern corner of Mississippi, was geographically and climatically different from the rest of the state. The county sat in the southernmost extension of the Appalachian foothills. Its terrain of sandstone ridges and creek hollows more similar to the adjacent counties of Alabama to the east than to the Delta flatlands to the west. The winters were colder than the Mississippi average. January temperatures dropped to the low 20s in hard years, occasionally to the teens, and the summers were hot and humid in the specific way of the upper South. Sustained temperatures above 90 degrees from June through August, with relative humidity commonly at 70 to 80% through those months. This combination, cold enough in winter to freeze outdoor root pits in the worst cold snaps, hot enough in summer to mold loft-stored seeds in a wet August, was the specific two-season vulnerability that made the Tishomingo County storage problem more severe than either of the problems alone. A farmer in Maine faced the winter freeze problem, but not the summer heat problem. A farmer in the Mississippi Delta faced the summer mold problem, but not the winter freeze problem. A Tishomingo County farmer faced both the outdoor root pit that most Tishomingo County families used, was a compromise that worked adequately in mild years and failed in extreme ones. Dug 3 to 4 feet deep in a relatively high location to avoid flooding, covered with boards and earth to keep the temperature above freezing. The root pit maintained approximately 45 to 50 degrees through normal winters and kept most vegetables through March. In the winters with hard cold snaps, January temperatures at 15 to 20 degrees for more than a week, the pit temperature dropped to the upper 30s, and the sweet potatoes, which were particularly sensitive to temperatures below 40 degrees, began to develop the chilling injury that softened them and made them unsuitable for planting stock. The loft storage for seeds and dried goods was another compromise that worked in dry years and failed in wet ones. The loft was accessible from inside the cabin and was protected from rain and animals, but its temperature and humidity were set by the outside air. The attic space of a board and batten cabin was only loosely enclosed and exchanged air with the outside continuously. In a dry summer, the loft maintained 50% relative humidity and 60 to 70 degree temperature, which was adequate for seed storage. In a wet summer with sustained high humidity, the loft humidity rose above 65% and seeds stored in crocks with imperfect lid seals absorbed moisture through the seals and developed surface mold. The 1875 summer had been wet, the wettest July in Tishomingo County in 8 years, according to the county records. The loft humidity had been above 70% for most of July. The seed corn crock, which had survived 5 previous summers in the same loft, had failed in the 6th because the 7th summer was wet enough to defeat the lid seal. Frau Hirsch's underfloor system had been built for a German family, accustomed to below-grade root cellar storage as the standard approach to winter food preservation. In Baden, the root cellar was the universal provision, dug deep enough to maintain a consistent 45 to 50 degrees year-round, accessed from inside the house or from a covered passage. The Hirsch family had attempted to replicate the root cellar's temperature characteristics in a Mississippi crawl space by skirting and enclosing it, and had succeeded because the Mississippi ground temperature at 24-inch depth was within a few degrees of the same earth temperature stability that the German root cellar provided. What Frau Hirsch had added that no standard German root cellar contained was the 3-zone organization and the targeted east zone ventilation. The German root cellar was a single cold space. The Hirsch underfloor system was 3 different conditions in one space, matched to 3 different storage requirements. This was the specific design intelligence that Beulah had observed in 1868 and retained, and that she adapted in 1875 to a cabin with different dimensions and a summer humidity problem that the Hirsch farm had solved with the vent, and she had confirmed solved it again. The German immigrant family had brought the knowledge of below-grade storage from a region where it was universal. They had adapted it to Mississippi construction and climate. Beulah had observed the adaptation, retained it for 7 years, and adapted it again to her own farm's specific dimensions and her own supply's specific composition. 3 steps of adaptation across 2 cultural backgrounds and several decades, each step preserving the core principle, the Earth's stable temperature as the storage foundation, and modifying the details to match the new context. The comparison between Beulah Pace's zoned underfloor system and the prior storage innovations in the series places the system in a specific category that none of the prior scripts had occupied. The designed multi-purpose system as opposed to the single-purpose solution. Every prior innovation in the series had been designed to solve one specific problem: the buried woodpile inaccessibility, the green wood inadequate drying, the outdoor cellar walk in storms, the north wall unused cold. Each was complete and successful within its scope, and each was adapted to the specific combination of resources and circumstances of its inventor. None had attempted to address multiple storage problems simultaneously within a single structure. The underfloor system was a designed whole, 3 zones for 3 different supply types, each zone using the available thermal conditions differently, the zones sharing a single enclosed space and a single set of trapdoor access points. The design required understanding not just what each supply type needed, but how the cabin's specific thermal geography, the Earth's ground temperature, the stove's heat through the south floor boards, the east skirting's position relative to the summer wind, would produce different conditions in different sections of the same enclosed space. This was system thinking rather than problem-solving thinking. Beulah had not identified one problem and found one solution. She had identified 4 problems with different root causes and found that a single designed structure, properly organized, could address all for using the natural thermal and humidity conditions that were already present in the cabin's crawl space. The insight that made this possible was Frau Hirsch's, that the underfloor space was not uniform. It had a north side and a south side, an earth below, and a floor above, a potentially ventilated section, and a sealed section. These were not arbitrary differences, they were thermal and humidity zones, waiting to be used deliberately. The skirting captured the zones, the partitions defined them, the targeted vent activated one zone that the natural conditions alone could not adequately maintain. Beulah's adaptation to the Mississippi summer heat, the paramount concern that had motivated the construction after the seed corn loss, was not a modification of Frau Hirsch's design, so much as a validation that the design's core principle worked in a significantly more challenging climate. Northeast Mississippi's 95th degree. July was 20 degrees hotter than the comparable German or Tennessee summer that the Hirsch family had designed for. The North Zone stayed at 58 to 62 degrees in a 95-degree July because the ground temperature did not change significantly with the outdoor air temperature at 24-inch depth. The ground was the stabilizer, and the ground's stability was independent of the surface climate. The instruction paper she wrote for Ida Chumley in the autumn of 1876 was 3 pages, the longest in the series, reflecting the complexity of the 3-zone construction. It organized the construction in 5 steps: skirting, partitioning, trapdoor cutting, zone fitting, and loading sequence. It described the temperature characteristics of each zone and the specific supply types for which each zone was suitable. It included the vent management note, full open April through October, quarter-inch crack, November through March. And it included a note about the sand bins that none of the prior instruction papers in the series had needed to address. Fill the sand boxes dry. Wet sand imported from the creek will raise the North Zone humidity and defeat the storage. Dry the sand in the sun for 2 days before loading it into the bins. The instruction paper noted the Hirsch family as the source of the system and described Beulah's encounter with Frau Hirsch's underfloor space in 1868. The note was precise. I saw this at the Hirsch farm when I came for the birth of their grandchild in the summer of 1868. Frau Hirsch showed me the 3 zones and explained each one. I remembered it when I lost the seed corn in August of 1875 and needed a solution that worked in summer as well as winter. The note named Frau Hirsch. The Tishomingo County farmers, circle that Ida Chumley addressed in 1877, named both Frau Hirsch and Beulah Pace when it circulated the technique in its quarterly report. The Mississippi Board of Agriculture's 1879 summary noted the underfloor system as originating with a German immigrant family in Tishomingo County and adapted by a local farmer after observing it. The chain was preserved. The German family from Baden, who had brought below-grade storage knowledge to northeast Mississippi in 1851. The midwife, who had observed the system in 1868 and retained it 7 years. The neighbor, who built from the instruction paper in 1876 and reported it to the circle in 1877. The attribution stayed intact across the transmission. It stayed intact because Beulah had named Frau Hirsch in the instruction paper. She had named the source because the source was accurate and because the source deserved the naming. The economics of the underfloor system across Beulah Pace's 11 years of use on the Tishomingo County farm, from the first full year of operation in 1876 to her death in 1886, produced savings that were more substantial than those of any prior storage innovation in the series because the system addressed losses across multiple supply categories simultaneously. Before the system, she estimated from the 1875 experience and the records she had kept in the farm notebook that annual storage losses ran approximately 30% of the total food supply put up in autumn. Root vegetables lost 15 to 20% to rot in the summer heat or to freeze damage in January cold snaps. Seeds required replacement stock every 3 to 4 years when a wet summer killed the saved seed. Cured meats required trimming for surface mold in approximately 60% of summers. Dried herbs needed to be regathered every 2 years rather than every 3 because the loft heat degraded their potency. After the system, total food supply loss dropped to less than 5%. Root vegetables, 3% loss, primarily from the spring loading, when the vegetables were still carrying some field moisture that continued to process in storage. Seeds, no losses through 1886, 11 consecutive years of viable seed corn from the same variety that had been lost to mold in 1875. Cured meats, no surface mold requiring trimming after the first winter of system operation. Dried herbs remained potent for 3 to 4 years in the South Zone, restoring the full maintenance interval. The annual value of these savings at Tishomingo County market prices in the mid-1870s was approximately $3 to $4 per year, a significant sum on a 20-acre subsistence farm where the total cash outlay for the year might be $15 to $20. Over 11 years, $33 to $44 in preserved food supply, plus the incalculable value of the seed corn line that had been maintained without interruption since 1831, except for the single 1875 loss. The construction cost, $1.40 in purchased hardware. All other materials from the farm at no cash cost. Recovery of the construction cost, approximately 6 months into the first full year of operation. The system paid for itself before summer ended. Ida Chumley built her system in October and November of 1876 and reported to the Tishomingo County Farmers' Circle in the spring of 1877 that she had lost no seeds and no root vegetables through the winter, and had confirmed in March that all 3 zones were maintaining their temperature ranges as the instruction paper described. She noted that her East Zone vent management in the first winter had required some adjustment. She had initially closed it fully rather than cracking it, and had noticed the closed smell that Beulah had described in the note about the quarter-inch winter position. She cracked it to the specified position, and the smell cleared. 3 more Tishomingo County farms built underfloor systems from the instruction paper in 1877 and 1878. The Circle's 1878 report described the technique as the most comprehensive storage improvement to appear in the county in the preceding decade, noting that it addressed summer preservation as well as winter accessibility, which no prior technique had done. Summer preservation as well as winter accessibility. This was the specific contribution of the underfloor system to the series. It solved the year-round problem, not the seasonal one. Every prior storage innovation had been triggered by a winter problem: the buried woodpile, the frozen root pit, the outdoor cellar walk in storm conditions. The underfloor system had been triggered by a summer problem: the molded seed corn in the hot loft, and had then proved to solve the winter problem as well. All year long, the supplies stayed safe through the Mississippi summer heat that had destroyed the seed corn, and through the Mississippi winter cold snaps that froze the outdoor pit's sweet potatoes. The ground under the cabin maintained the earth's stable temperature, regardless of what the air above it was doing. The ground did not know what season it was. Beulah Pace had built a system that used this fact. The winter validation of the underfloor system, the second half of the all-year-long claim in the title, came in January of 1877, when a cold snap drove the Tishomingo County temperature to 18 degrees for 6 consecutive days. Beulah opened the North Zone trapdoor on the morning of January 14th, the second day of the cold snap, and reached into the sand bin for sweet potatoes. She retrieved 3, firm, no soft spots. She pressed her palm flat against the sand surface at the bottom of the bin, feeling the temperature, cold, approximately 42 to 45 degrees, the sand slightly cooler than the air above it in the zone, above freezing. The sweet potatoes were intact. At Ida Chumley's farm, the outdoor root pit had frozen during the night. The ground above the pit had frozen to 6 inches depth, and the air in the pit, accessible only from the exterior door set into the pit's wooden roof, had dropped to 34 degrees, which was above the sweet potatoes' chilling injury threshold of about 40 degrees in theory, but close enough to the threshold that the sweet potatoes on the upper shelf of the pit, directly beneath the cold roof structure, had begun to show the slight discoloration that preceded softening. Ida came to Beulah's farm on January 16th, day 4 of the cold snap, to compare notes. She had brought 3 of her pit sweet potatoes, 2 firm ones from the bottom of the pit, and 1 slightly soft one from the upper shelf. She put them on the table beside 3 of Beulah's North Zone sweet potatoes. The 3 from Beulah's North Zone were indistinguishable from the firm lower pit potatoes. The slightly soft upper pit potato showed the beginning of the chilling injury that would progress to rot if the cold continued. Ida said, "Your potatoes are the same temperature as mine." "How are they not soft?" Beulah said. "The ground under the cabin never gets to the outside air temperature. The cold snap drives the air temperature to 18 degrees, but the ground at 2 feet depth stays in the 40s. My potatoes are sitting in 42-degree sand. Yours are sitting in a pit that cools to 34 on the shelf closest to the cold air coming through the roof structure." Ida said, "The sand keeps them at the ground temperature rather than the air temperature." Beulah said, "The sand and the enclosure together. The skirting keeps the cold air from circulating under the cabin. The earth radiates stable temperature upward. The sand fills the air spaces around the potatoes, so the air temperature in the zone does not matter. The potatoes are in direct contact with the sand, which is in contact with the earth below. This was the specific design advantage of the sand bins over open shelf storage, direct contact with a high thermal mass medium. A potato on a shelf sat in air, and air temperature in an enclosed space fluctuates with the conditions outside, even if the fluctuation is moderated. A potato buried in sand sat in direct contact with a material that changed temperature slowly and held the Earth's ambient temperature through short cold snaps. The sand was acting as a thermal buffer between the potato and the air. The same way the earth-sheltered woodshed's earth roof had acted as a thermal buffer in Selah Cord's Maryland system, but here the buffering was applied directly to the individual vegetables in storage rather than to the walls of the storage structure. The 2-foot depth of the crawl space, the 24 inches between the ground and the floor joists, was barely sufficient for this buffering to operate. At shallower depth, the ground temperature would have been more variable, responding more rapidly to the outdoor cold snaps. At 18 inches, the January cold snap might have penetrated to the sand surface and chilled the upper layer of the bins. At 24 inches, the ground temperature was stable enough through a 6-day cold snap at 18 degrees that the sand bins remained at 42 to 45 degrees throughout. Beulah had not chosen the cabin's crawlspace depth. It was what Calvin's grandfather had built in 1848 and what the cabin had always had. but she had chosen to build the system in that specific crawl space, rather than proposing a deeper excavation, which she had considered and rejected. She had pressed her hand to the ground surface in the crawl space in August 1875, feeling the temperature, cool, distinctly below the 90-degree outdoor air, clearly in the 58 to 62-degree range she had felt in Frau Hirsch's North Zone in 1868. The existing depth was adequate. She did not need to dig. The ground was ready. She only needed to enclose it. The specific role of Boulah's experience as a community midwife in producing the underfloor system requires attention, because the knowledge transmission in this script moved through a professional network rather than through the family or neighbor relationships that had characterized most prior knowledge transfers in the series. Beulah had been the informal midwife for Tishomingo County's Hill Farm community since 1863, when the county's only trained physician was serving with the Confederate forces, and the women of the county organized their own birth assistance network. She had attended 43 births by 1875, traveling to farms across the full extent of the county on roads that were sometimes passable by horse and sometimes not. Arriving at households she might see once a year or once every 2 years, staying for the labor and the first days of recovery before returning to her own farm. The midwife's circuit gave her access to a range of household practices that no other single person in the county had observed. She had seen how 20 different families stored their winter provisions, how 8 different families managed their medicinal supplies, how the German immigrant families in the eastern part of the county built their underfloor storage, and why it produced better outcomes than the Scotserish root pits and loft storage that the majority of the county's families used. She had seen the Hirsch system in 1868 as part of this circuit and had carried the observation back to her own farm in the same way she carried observations about midwifery technique, herb preparation, and infant care as professional knowledge accumulated through the circuit of observation that her role provided. This was the knowledge pathway that no prior script in the series had used, professional circuit knowledge, accumulated through a service role that moved through multiple households and preserved observations from households that the preserver would otherwise never have contact with. Ephraim Basham, in Alabama, had observed the Cherokee practice once as a traveler and reported it once at a family fireside. Selah Cord in Maryland had received a single description from Jonas during a ridge walk. Beulah had visited 43 households in 12 years of midwife circuit and had accumulated a comparative knowledge of Tishomingo County household practice that no farmer staying on her own farm could have assembled. The Hirsch observation was one item in a larger catalog. When she needed it, when the seed corn was destroyed in August 1875, and she needed a year-round storage solution, she retrieved it from the catalog because it was there, had been there for 7 years, and was precisely applicable to the problem she had defined. The midwife circuit as knowledge transmission vehicle appeared in this series for the first and only time in Boulah's story. It was not the only way practical knowledge moved through rural communities in the 1870s. The series had shown it moving through family conversation, professional carpentry observation, Cherokee cultural memory, and timber cruiser field practice. The midwife circuit was the most systematic of these vehicles, because it moved regularly through the community rather than traveling once, and because it recorded observations from households that had different backgrounds and practices, and that the observer would compare and evaluate against each other over years of repeated contact. Frau Hirsch had the best herbs in Tishomingo County, as Ida Chumley remembered. She had the best herbs because she stored them correctly, as Beulah said. Beulah had seen how she stored them. 7 years later, she had built the system that kept her own herbs correctly. The instruction paper Beulah wrote for Ida Chumley in the autumn of 1876 was 3 pages, the longest construction document in the series, and it was organized in a way that none of the prior instruction papers had been, by zone rather than by construction step, with each zone's temperature, characteristics, intended supplies, and specific construction features described together before moving to the next zone. She had organized the paper this way because she had tried writing it by construction step, first skirting, then partitions, then trapdoors, then zone features, and had found that this sequence obscured the logic of the system. A reader who followed the construction step sequence without understanding why each zone needed different features would build a physically correct structure without understanding how to use it. She wanted Ida to understand the system before she built it, not after. She rewrote it, beginning with what she called the zone logic. The north zone is cold because the ground is cold, and the north side gets no sun. The south zone is slightly warmer because the stove heat comes through the floor, and the south skirting absorbs some solar warmth. The east zone needs ventilation because cured meat develops surface mold in a sealed, humid space, and the 2-inch vent moves the humid air through before it can settle on the meat surface. Each zone uses a different natural condition present in the underfloored space. The construction captures and separates these conditions. The stored supplies are matched to the zone that provides their required conditions. The zone logic paragraph was followed by the construction sequence, and the construction sequence followed the building order, skirting first, because without the enclosure there are no stable zones to work with. Partitions second, to define the zone boundaries. Trapdoors third, zone-specific features fourth. Loading last. The loading sequence note was one of the most specific in any instruction paper in the series. Load the north zone sand bins with dry vegetables only, no surface moisture on the skins. Surface moisture in the sand bins raises the zone humidity and can promote surface mold even at the north zone's cold temperature. Load the seed packets in the south zone with the packets standing upright, not lying flat. Lying flat presses the packet faces against the rack surface and reduces air circulation. Load the east zone smoked meats on hooks, not shelves. Hanging allows air to circulate on all surfaces. A ham on a shelf rests on one surface that does not see air movement. Load dry, stand upright, hang, do not shelf. 3 instructions, each addressing a failure mode that Frau Hirsch's system, or Beulah's own first winter, had revealed. Dry, because wet produced mold in the sand. Upright, because flat restricted air. Hung, because shelved concentrated moisture at the contact surface. The instruction paper concluded with a sentence that appeared in a different form in most of the instruction papers in this series. The system works because the ground works. Your construction captures what the ground provides. If the ground temperature in your crawl space is different from mine, if your cabin sits in a different orientation or over different soil, the zone temperatures will be slightly different. Check each zone in the first November with your hand pressed against the Earth's surface. If the north zone feels near body temperature, add more insulation to the north skirting. If the east zone develops the closed smell within 2 weeks of sealing the vent, crack the vent to the 1/4-inch position. The system works because the ground works. Adjust the construction to what your ground provides. The system was designed The instruction paper explained the design. The adjustments were calibrated to the specific ground. The principle was portable. The details were local. Bula Pace Nigan had lost her seed corn in August of 1875. She had remembered Frau Hirsch's underfloor space from 7 years before. She had built the system in September and October of 1875. The seed corn had survived every subsequent summer. The sweet potatoes had survived every subsequent winter cold snap. The hams had dried without surface mold. The chamomile had kept its scent and its potency all year long. The supplies stayed safe all year long. The ground did not know what season it was. She had built a system that used this fact. The system had worked for 11 years. The ground had not changed.